Let's take a look at the road to revolution. So let's first start with British control. So as we talked about before, you have the French and Indian War happening in the United States, and upon the end of the French and Indian War, the colonists are looking pretty optimistic. They had formed colonial militias during the war, which are military forces made up of local citizens that were there to help protect their towns, their lands, their nations. And they had fought alongside the British and they had won. Also, the colonies are prospering once again, okay? Trade is happening, things are good. But there is starting to be dissatisfaction with Britain. British colonies were the only European colonies where ordinary people could vote for local legislatures. Okay. The freedom to govern was limited by King George III in Parliament, but local legislatures like the House of Burgesses had support from its mother company, and they were supporting their mother country. Okay. The French and Indian War had been very costly, and the king wanted the Native Americans and colonists to stay away from each other. And so that was why he passed that proclamation of 1763. Remember, that's that law that required the colonists to stay east of the Appalachian Mountains and stay out of the Indian Territory. And this upset many of the settlers. They felt restricted. They're also incredibly upset because they're like, okay, then why the heck did we fight this war against the French and the Indians? The problem was we were in this land and the Native Americans were upset about it. We fought, we won, we should be able to go there. So they just kept settling west of the line. And due to the debt of the war, the British couldn't really send soldiers to enforce that proclamation. And so settlers continued to flood over the Appalachian Mountains into Native American territory. Well, in 1765, the British government passes the Quartering Act. This is going to become one of several British laws, and it required American colonists to provide housing and food for British soldiers stationed in North America. Following the French and Indian War, the British soldiers had moved into cities and they needed places to stay. Okay? It did not allow soldiers to kick people out of their homes, but people resented the idea that they were being forced to house these soldiers and feed them. The New York Colonial Assembly flat out refused to enforce the Quartering Act. And the presence of British troops really provoked tension and hostility between the colonists and those troops that were stationed there. So go ahead and take a minute here, pause, and answer the following question. What were the goals of the Proclamation of 1763 and the Quartering Act? 2, what does prosperous mean in the sentence? After decades of economic growth, the colonists were prosperous. Again, fighting a war is very, very expensive, and so Britain is heavily in debt. Keeping 10,000 soldiers in North America to continue to protect the colonists costs money too, so the government needed some revenue, which is just another word for income. King George III appointed a new prime minister named George Grenville, and both of the men, George Grenville and King George III, believed that the colonists needed to be strictly controlled. They felt like they had gotten too much freedom, gotten too used to kind of just doing their own thing, and they needed to kind of be reined in again. And Grenville also believes colonies need to pay their fair share of that war debt and the cost of housing those troops. Understand that the 13 colonies are not the only colonies in North America for Britain. But out of all the colonies, they pay the least amount of taxes. Okay, all the other colonies are paying around 26 shillings a year. The colonists are paying 1. Okay, and so Britain thinks this is only fair. They had benefited the most from the war, and so they began to look at ways that they could tax the colonists. So the first attempt happened in 1764. That was called the Sugar Act. It was a British law that lowered the duty on molasses to cut out smuggling so that the British would get the revenue. Okay, they wanted to collect money off of sugar, something that we don't grow in the United States. Duty, by the way, is a fancy word for a tax on imports, goods coming into a country. They also passed the 1764 Currency Act, and this was a British law that regulated paper money in the American colonies. So before this act, each colony was printing its own paper money. Now they were told they could only use British money. And there was a shortage of British currency, and it caused large economic inflation. Things started to cost more. And of course, the colonists aren't happy about this either. Colonists voiced their grievances or objections or reasons to complain to the king, to their royal governors, but they didn't listen. The colonists had come to resent mercantilism, that economic system based on trade that mostly benefited the mother country, right? We created the raw materials here in the 13 colonies and shipped it over to Europe to be refined into things to sell, and Europe was reaping the benefits. They were also further upset by the tightening of the Navigation Acts to control trade and shipping. If you remember, the Navigation Acts essentially said that anything coming to the United States had to be on a British ship. Okay. They began to accuse Britain of tyranny, which is unjust rule by an absolute leader. And maybe the most famous words of the American Revolution, there was no taxation, or no taxation without representation. So they believed that Parliament didn't have the right to impose these direct taxes on the colonists because they didn't have a vote in Parliament. Now, they believed the colonies could impose taxes, but that's because they were voting in their local elections. Go ahead and pause, and you can answer these two questions. In what ways did the British government try to raise revenue and control the colonies at the same time? And what impact did these acts likely have on the ways colonists did business? Now, the Stamp Act of 1765. This is a British law requiring colonists to purchase a stamp for official documents and published papers. And the only purpose of this was to raise revenue to pay for the soldiers that are being housed in the 13 colonies. So all printed materials had to have a special stamp. This could be newspapers, pamphlets, a deck of cards, a postcard, parchment to write a letter on. Everything had to have this stamp. And you could only buy stamps in gold or silver. Again, using just British currency, which is extremely rare in the colonies. And what they started doing was enforcing this law by taking land and property away that were involved in sales conducted without these stamps. And this is really the act that just really gets under the colonists' skin. So colonists are growing angry. And under the leadership of a man named Patrick Henry, who was a young politician from Virginia, they begin to think of ways that they can kind of fight back. And so Patrick Henry persuades the House of Burgesses, which is again the legislative organization in Virginia, to pass a series of resolutions to defend the colonists' right to tax themselves rather than Parliament. Other colonies begin to follow suit. Rhode Island ignores the stamp tax altogether, and colonists begin to realize they had more in common with each other than the British, and they began to organize. This is one thing King George III couldn't really see happening. He thought that each colony had their own goals in mind, what they wanted, and he never suspected that they would be able to unite together. In Boston, they rioted against the Stamp Act. They destroyed the homes of officials in charge of stamping documents and the governor. Protesters in other colonies also acted to prevent the distribution of stamps, and by 1765, in Georgia, all the stamp distributors had resigned. It was that bad and that dangerous. This is all being led by a group called the Sons of Liberty. This is a group of merchants, shopkeepers, and craftsmen who successfully opposed the Stamp Act by establishing networks to boycott British goods. So remember that a boycott is a form of protest that involves refusing to purchase goods or services. I think many times we also have in our mind the Sons of Liberty only existed in New England. Specifically, we're thinking of like Samuel Adams, those kinds of things. There are actually groups of Sons of Liberty throughout all 13 colonies. Merchants in New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia agreed to stop importing British goods. And in 1766, this actually works. Parliament ends up repealing or canceling the Stamp Act. This was the first major step toward independence. And Ben Franklin, who is maybe the most well-known American at this time in history, is actually in London at this time as a representative for the colony of Pennsylvania. And he talks to Parliament, and Parliament's asking him questions. And he pretty much tells them that the colonies aren't trying to rebel, but if you keep enforcing these things, they will. And that really helps lead to the repealing of the Stamp Act. So go ahead, answer these 3 questions. How did the Stamp Act raise revenue for the British government? And why did the Stamp Act provoke such a strong response? And what events led up to the repeal of the Stamp Act? All right, so Ben Franklin, okay, not a president. If you don't remember anything else from my class, remember that Ben Franklin is not a president. At 17, he ran away from home in Boston. He grew up in a large family, and as a son was expected to help keep the family afloat. So when he runs away, he ends up in Philadelphia, and he begins working as a printer, inventor, and a scientist. He becomes the colonial representative in England, and in 1765, he was representing the colonists against that Stamp Act like I talked about. He opposed it, but he didn't think it could be stopped, and this really began to hurt his reputation amongst the colonists. He was surprised by the uproar that was happening in the colonies, and he spoke to Parliament condemning the act and explaining the colonists' position. And this is really the first moment that Benjamin Franklin really starts to question his loyalty to Britain. He is a supporter of independence. He tried to smooth over the differences between Britain and the colonies, but he worked with Thomas Hutchinson, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And Hutchinson was supposed to be defending the rights of the colonists, but he was actually working with the king to limit those rights. And Franklin uncovered some letters and sent them to America while he was still in London. This only fuels the colonists' anger. And once British Parliament finds out, they condemn Franklin and he returns to America. This experience convinced Franklin that it was time for the colonies to break away from Britain. Okay, he had created the Join or Die cartoon in 1754 during the French and Indian War, the early days, and it was meant to urge the colonies to unite at that time to fight together to protect themselves from the French and the Indians. But now it was to unite and fight Great Britain. It became a symbol of colonial unity. Benjamin Franklin would go on to be one of 5 men who draft the Declaration of Independence and among one of the first to sign it. Go ahead and pause and answer these 2 questions. What realization led to Franklin's dissatisfaction with British rule? Franklin said he was feeling his Americanness as never before. How might Franklin have described the American identity at the time in history?